Hello.
Hi.
Welcome to A Flat Pack History of Sweden.
Yeah, I'm Elsa.
I'm Chris.
Before we get started, as you know, we don't have ads on this podcast, but we do like to recommend other podcasts when we get the chance.
Yeah, and one of those that we've been listening to a lot recently is one called the Assassinations Podcast. So I'll let Neil introduce it for us.
Guns, knives, poison, bombs. Time and again, assassins have sought to change the course of history through one single, terrible act. I'm Neil Cooper, the host of Assassinations Podcast. Join me each week as I explore the darker side of history. New episodes are released every Monday and are available on iTunes and our website, assassinationspodcast.com.
Yeah, do check out the Assassinations podcast. It's really interesting. They did a recent one on the merger of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in the 1980s, which was really, really good.
Something that we'll reach in a few episodes' time, probably a couple of hundred episodes' time.
Yeah.
There's also some really good fun ones. There's a mini episode on this guy who was killed at a fancy dress party in Switzerland by a guy dressed up as a bear. And then there's loads of really cool episodes. So do check Niall out.
Indeed, but now back to Swedish history.
Yes. This is episode 9.
Yeah.
We're calling this one Mind the Gap.
Mind the Gap. I was going to do a London Tube announcement thing, but that is where, by the way, if you're not familiar with the phrase Mind the Gap, it comes from an announcement on the London Underground system where there's a little gap between the train and the platform. So the announcement goes, doors closing, mind the gap, or something like that.
Just not in that Cockney accent.
What are you telling me that life in London is not like a 1940s film?
Correct.
All right, all on board. That was the pirate version. I'm going to
That
stop
wasn't
now.
a pirate.
I'm
Anyway,
going to stop now and let Chris get on with why we're calling this episode Mind the Gap.
well, I thought you wanted to talk about why.
Yeah, I could. So we're finishing off the Iron Age, which we've spent the last 2 episodes talking about. And now we're finishing that off and we're heading into the Viking period. But before we sort of fully open that door, we wanted to just pause for a bit and talk about subject areas where sort of fact and myth interact and where it's sometimes unclear what really happened and what is people's interpretations of what happened. So there's a bit of a gap between real history, if you want to call it that, and interpreted mythological history. Hence, mind the gap between fact and fiction.
But also mind the gap between the Iron Age and the Viking Age, which isn't really a gap. It doesn't really exist. It wasn't sort of Iron Age, and then suddenly they woke up one morning, 9 a.m, and put on their Viking gear and said, right, we're Vikings now. There wasn't that sort of actual gap, however long the gap is supposed to be. It was just a seamless transition, which just went on over time, and people wouldn't have just suddenly said, oh, I'm now a Viking.
Yeah.
So it's mind the gap. It wasn't even a gap.
Nope.
So yeah, that's quite interesting. But before we do that, it's time for our tradition of starting with a Swedish phrase. So
Indeed, Swedish phrase of the week.
yeah, you've got one.
I've got one, and it's att sitta I främsta rummet. Literally translated to English, it means to place something in the first room. And the meaning is to make something the most important, to prioritize something.
So you could say something like in Swedish, man måste sätta sin familj i första rummet.
Yeah, which literally would mean one has to place one's family in the first room, but the meaning of it is that you have to prioritize your family. You have to put them first.
So that's what a politician would say when they're resigning.
For example,
Yep.
yes. And we are now going to put fact versus fiction, Iron Age, Viking Age in the first room and highlight this intersection where factual accounts of what happened in previous eras blends with myths and fiction. So sometimes people have willfully lied to boost their own or their clan or their country's powers and to weaken their enemy. Sometimes people wrote down accounts as myths and stories, but they have later been interpreted as facts. And sometimes there is a grain of truth that then gets blown out of proportion by a mountain of falsehood. Sometimes it's the case that something was interpreted as a fact, but later studies and improved research methods has proven that it wasn't a fact. And very often it's sort of a mix of all of these factors.
So we're going to dive into that mix and try and unmix it for you.
Yeah, and why are we doing it now? Because, like Chris said, this is sort of a fact in history in general. First of all, this is a time in history and in Scandinavian history in particular when we see a lot this intermingling of fact and fiction. Most notably, perhaps, with the sagas that you will come to later.
And secondly, we just want to sort of highlight the complexity of studying and retelling history. We don't want to sort of start playing loose with important concepts like truth and fact. We do like funny stories and things like that about like the pooping cows and all of that. But that's because it happened. It's true.
Yeah.
So we want to try and say what is the truth, but acknowledge that, as also said, a lot of things have been called truth before and are now being disproven or added nuance to it. And that is definitely the case with things like sagas. So really, it's quite good to be able to take off these rose-tinted glasses in terms of the truth, if that's even a way of saying it, and then look at something in a more holistic manner.
Yeah, definitely. But also, it's really fun. A lot of what we'll see in this episode, the stuff that is stories rather than perhaps factual accounts, they're hilarious. We've got some kings coming up that are literally quite out of this world.
But that's good because although whilst we can say that it's not a historical account of that king, it can give you an insight into the mentality or the type of society at the time. And that's certainly, I think, what a lot of saga scholarship is going into in terms of, it might not be an exact, precise biography of this king, but it's telling you what kings would have been doing and how they would have acted.
And it says a lot about the people who wrote down these more or less factually accurate accounts, because it tells you of what they wanted their world to be. In a sense. So we're going to talk about 3 subject matters in particular, because they are areas where we see this mix of fact and fiction particularly clearly in this Iron Age, Viking Age gap. Chris, you're going to talk about the famous sagas, but also touch upon other works of literature, if we call it that, writings, poetry. And I'm going to talk a bit about the peoples or the tribes and kings who are more or less mythical.
Sounds like a plan.
It does sound like a plan. We've been talking about it for 2 weeks now. It's a good plan.
Yeah, it better be a good plan. Right, so sagas.
Yay!
So saga in Old Norse simply meant a story, and that could be any story.
Yeah.
The words related to the word saya, which means say, and it could be used about anything that was told or written down or portrayed to people, regardless of its form or origin.
To be fair, in modern Swedish today, the word saga is also the noun that just means fairy tale. So Cinderella is a saga in modern Swedish. It's the word for fairy tale, but we're now talking about a very specific kind of sagas.
Yeah, because you could say that in English as well. Yeah. The epic saga of Joan of Arc or something. Her life was a saga.
But in the Old Norse context, saga is a specific thing.
Yeah. But whilst a saga is a specific thing, like most things, there are different types of them. I'm going to read out a few of the titles and say what they're about, but my Old Norse isn't perfect, so
Oh no, all those native speakers of Old Norse will phone in from beyond the grave and complain.
Well, if you read some of the sagas, they probably would. Once they figure out what a phone is. But so there's the Fornaldur Saga, which are mythical or heroic sagas, a bit like the Odyssey if you want a different comparison. Then there's the Konunga Saga, the Saga of the Kings. And whilst the sagas are generally seen as a bit of an Icelandic thing, the Konunga Saga are actually usually more about kings of Norway because they got up to more fun things, I think. Then there's the Icelandic Saga, which are family sagas or the sagas of the Icelanders. And so this is about famous Icelandic families, and these are dated to 850 to 1050.
Now, I like to, in my mind, I like to see the Icelandic saga as the, like, EastEnders and Coronation Street of the day. They're like tales of important families that interact with each other.
But then, well, I guess that would make sense. EastEnders and Coronation Street are British family soaps where in every episode almost there's a murder or a wedding or someone calls someone a bad name. So that might actually be appropriate. And then there are also a couple of others. There's which I love the name of, the Samtida Saga, which literally means the same time sagas. And these are about contemporaneous events that the writers themselves would have witnessed during 12th and 13th century Iceland.
All right, so where sort of the Konunga Saga and the Icelandic Saga were, when they were written, talked about history, the Samtida Saga, when they were written, were contemporary to the time they were written in.
So more like a kind of a newspaper.
So the Samtida Saga, what else?
And then you have a load of others. They have their own categories, but we don't need to list them all because we'll probably do a proper whole episode on the sagas at some point. But there are sagas on bishops specifically, chivalric romances, which are sort of more European-y history. And then they also translated classic Latin and Roman works into a more Icelandic theme. So that's more like Shakespeare, I guess, doing Richard III or something.
Oh, right. So they sort of did retellings of other works.
Yeah. And so one thing to note about the sagas is they were really plentiful in Iceland because of this quite curious mix of society that went on in Iceland at the time. Because there were two main groups of people in Iceland at that time, if you forget about the peasants, and that was the chieftain families and the church. But in Iceland, the chieftain families either ran or sort of were the church. So they could monopolize all the writing and get them to write about whatever they wanted. And the chieftain families, whilst they were in control of and part of this church system, they did actually want to write about their pagan past and their general history of Iceland, whereas others, sort of monks in 12th century France, weren't interested at all in writing about their pagan history and the Gauls and things like that.
So we have in Iceland a bit of an exception to the rule where we get non-religious themed literature from this time.
Written by religious people. Yeah. So that's, I found that quite interesting.
Yeah.
And that's because, as I briefly said, the chieftains took an interest in their own history. History in the sense of preserving traditions and poetry and epic tales, not necessarily history as in on the 7th of March, 807, Snorri killed Olaf. And there are definitely massive differences between the genres themselves too. The Fornaldur Saga are about traditional legends and mythical heroes, or sort of like Marvel comic books in a way of looking at history if that was a thing. And they were supposed to have lived in the ancient era before the Vikings existed, whereas the Konunga Saga and the Icelandic Saga are seen as more realistic in, you know, quote marks, because they had more exhaustive narrative sections and they actually spoke about events themselves in a much more plausible way. The differences between these genres has led to some previous scholars to think that some could definitely be counted as history and some as entertainment, or, fiction. But this is quite controversial as they're all supposed to be entertaining, at least in some way. And certainly in all of them are supposed to be at least a little bit loyal to what's happened in the past. So they're all on a scale. But
they're all in this gap that
Yeah.
we're talking about between fact and fiction.
yeah. And there's enough fiction in all of the sagas to make them unreliable as precise historical sources, but that doesn't mean they should be read like a novel, because they all claim to represent at least some sort of truth to the Icelanders of the time. So it's quite interesting.
Definitely.
And another sort of historical way of looking at the study of sagas is that previously scholars thought that some would have been passed down as oral texts from generation to generation before finally being written down once they learned what writing was about.
Yeah.
And some people think that they were never really oral, but they were written down to begin with, maybe relying on a small bits of oral history, but were mainly written texts.
Okay.
And like with most things, modern day scholars agree that neither is particularly accurate, as they all vary. So there would have been oral history, but there would have been some people judging it on real historical events as well. So it's a big mix, really.
Yeah.
And to further complex things, a few of the Icelandic texts contain information that is about the public performance of sagas and sagas as real entertainment, as an event. And so we can see that sagas were definitely supposed to be performed, at least some of them, as an event in a big public gathering.
What, like a play?
Yeah, basically. But it would take over days.
Wow.
But this is also an example of how sagas can give you an insight into the general times and the history that they were talking about. Because there's a great piece that Lars Lundroth has highlighted in an article that he's written about the sagas. And there's a bit here that we're going to read out together. What we're going to read out is a piece where a young Icelander has made his way to the court of Harald Hardrada in Norway around 1050. Not in the morning, but 1050 the year.
Maybe it was both 10:15 in the year, but it was also 10:50 in the morning.
Yes. So when this Icelander arrives at Harald's court,
Yeah.
the king asks him, "Hey, man, do you want to serve me? What kind of talent do you have? Are you an accountant? Are you a good warrior? Or how can you help
So
me?"
this guy's thrown into a job interview with Harald Hardrada.
I guess, yeah. And the guy says, "Actually, I know the sagas really well." He's like, "Oh, okay, that's quite cool." And so the Icelander spends his whole life with Harald Hardrada, every evening telling a saga and performing a saga to the king and entertaining them.
He was like Harald Hardrada's live TV set.
Yeah, pretty much. And then he's doing this for a long time, and when Christmas comes around, he's only got one saga left. And that is actually a saga about Harald Hardrada when he was in the Viking bodyguards for the Eastern Roman emperors. And that's something we'll absolutely talk about later on. So there's loads of stories about Harald Hardrada because he was this great Viking. And the Icelander reads out his tale.
So
And-
essentially now the Icelander saga teller is doing a biopic of Harald Hardrada in saga form in front of Harald Hardrada.
Yeah.
That's the setting. All right.
So the Icelander has just finished telling the saga after many, many days, after 13 days apparently. And the king says to the Icelander, "Aren't you curious to know, Icelander, what I think of the story?"
I am afraid to ask, sire.
"I'm very pleased with it. It is perfectly faithful to the actual events. Who taught you the story?"
It was my custom out in Iceland to go to the Ting meeting every summer. And every summer I learned something of the story from Haldur Snorrason.
Ah, then it's not surprising that you know the story well, and it will turn out to your benefit. You're welcome to stay with me whenever you wish. And so in that, the king is asking him, he's like, "Oh, so it's entertaining, but how did you get the facts so right?" And he said, "Oh, I spoke a lot with someone who used to serve with you." So he was good friends with the king's advisor when he was in Constantinople. So we can see that the Icelander himself knows sagas, and the fact that he knows sagas really well is actually really good for him because the king appreciates it. And so it's really interesting, the fact that quite a few sagas would have been preserved in Norway where they would have been read aloud, and performed in this way. And the fact that they're talking about the accuracy of the sagas themselves shows that the king appreciates that some sagas aren't true and some sagas are more true. And so he's praising him for doing a good saga because it's correct.
Yeah.
But of course, the king wouldn't want the saga to say, oh yeah, at this battle we didn't really do much, he ran away or something like that. He would still want the saga to be embellished and portray him in a positive light.
This was just a little look of the sagas and the sagas as historical accounts of early Scandinavian and early Swedish history. If you're interested in sagas, it is a fascinating world of myths and legends and facts and everything in between. There's a podcast called Saga Thing.
They take sagas and sort of read them out and rank them and look into them, and they're actually both, I think, professors or at least doctors in sagas, so they know what they're talking about.
We'll link them on our social media because, if you want to learn more about sagas, there's a wealth of literature on it, but that's also a really great podcast.
Yeah. And some people, because we're talking about the pre-Christian world in a lot of this stuff, it can be seen as very pagan and very magic, and the events are sometimes influenced by fate and luck, and there's lots of dreams and visions. There are sometimes rituals and spells, but the gods themselves aren't really present too much. There's a couple that turn up in the Thornolda saga. Overall, the scholars pretty much agree that you shouldn't use sagas as official sources about major events and developments in the Viking Age, and there's no details about the invasion of England or the conversion of Scandinavia and settlement of Iceland in real sort of, let's put this in the encyclopedia fact sort of way. Because a lot of the stuff that is said and written down, archaeology or other written documents of the time have directly contradicted them. But it is a good way to look at the mentality or the way that society would have functioned, such as the fact that kings would listen to sagas and, appreciate that they were a good telling of his life and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's quite good. So that's the sagas done. Well, very briefly. We will reference them and talk about them a lot. So this is the only time they'll come up.
No, and therefore it's good to know what it is and briefly what they're about. And you mentioned that a lot of kings come up in the sagas.
Yes.
And so I thought I'd talk a bit about, because this is really a period when we start to get the first kings. But it's really up to how we want to interpret this. And the term king seems to get mixed up with deity or a godlike figure. So someone who wrote a lot of sagas and someone who's often mentioned in saga scripting is a man by the name of Snorre Sturluson, and he, among other things, he's famous for the Ynglinga saga, where he writes about Ylfe being the oldest recorded king of Scandinavia. So that would also maybe make him the first sort of king of Sweden.
And this would have been during our Iron Age episodes, before this point that we are currently up to in our chronology.
But Snorre Sturluson writes about it hundreds of years later. Just out of memory, I believe Sturluson wrote in the 12th or 13th century.
Yeah, that's most of them.
Yeah. So he writes about Ylfe being the earliest recorded king of Scandinavia. Now, I very much doubt that Ylfe was a real person. Just for starters, the Ynglinga saga talks about how Ylfe was seduced by a goddess, Gefjon, to give her as much land as she could plow in one night. I don't even understand what that means. Ylfe transformed her 4 sons into oxen and took enough land to create the Danish island of Zealand, leaving the Swedish lake Vänern. I don't even get that.
It's clearly rubbish.
Not rubbish, it's clearly like a tale.
Yeah.
And also, Ylfe is apparently Odin's dad. And Odin, as we all know, is the head of all gods in Norse mythology. So I don't really see how his dad could have been a real king. So yes, Ylfe is the first ever mentioned king of what could potentially be modern Swedish territory, but I think we can put Ylfe quite firmly in the fictional category.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk too much about these mythological kings like Ylfe, but in Swedish, the term that's used for these kings in quotation mark is sagokungar. So that would mean fairy tale kings, which I think is quite a good term because it quickly descends into the realm of fiction and fairy tales here. Like saga, it's still the Swedish word meaning fairy tale, and these kings are quite fictional. But then people have at times wanted to read them as real factual history because it suited their gain, as we talked about earlier. So using history and making things that was perhaps originally meant to be fictional and entertaining, making those factual historical accounts is a powerful tool to legitimize all manner of policies and practices. I mean, you can almost make something real by claiming it has roots in history. If you're someone in the 14th century who wants to get local power, well, you just tell people that you're a descendant of Ylfe, who was a king hundreds of years ago. And if Ylfe was meant to be a fictional character, he legitimizes your power in the present day. I must say, reading about these fairy tale kings, it reminded me a bit about reading the book of Genesis in the Bible. And anyone who's flicked through the first pages of a Bible will have read about how Adam lived to be 930 years old, for example. And it's sort of similar with these early kings. Just like in the book of Genesis, they live till they're hundreds of years old. They have kids when they're hundreds of years old.
Yeah, it's nothing that you can really claim to be factual.
No. So it's just for fun, I thought let's throw a dart at some of these fairy tale kings and see what stories we get.
So we can judge how accurate in general
Yeah.
they're going to be.
And also just so that we can enjoy a funny story
Yeah.
about something. So picked at random from this long list of ancient Norse, more or less mythical kings. There's Harald Hildetand, or Wartooth, as he's called in English.
Nice.
I mean, that's a great name.
Just one tooth that he...
Yeah.
Is that he has a really particularly pointy tooth that's good in war? Or does he have like a lucky tooth that he takes to war? I want to know more about this tooth.
I don't know. When I read it, I thought, there's a lot of debate about people our age when they get married. Whose last name should you have? And so on. I thought when I read this, if you and I get married, we should take the last name Wartooth.
Also, Wartooth.
Yeah, that would boost my career, I bet, if I introduced myself as Åsa Wartooth.
So what did he do?
He's mentioned in a half-finished Icelandic tale called Sagobrut that says that he was king of lots of people, but among others the Svitjod, who are believed to be early Swedes. So I like this guy, partly because of his last name, but also because he apparently married a woman called Åsa.
So there was a woman called Åsa Wartooth.
Maybe that means I can't claim the name.
Yeah, maybe.
She owns it. So Mr. Wartooth, or King Wartooth, died at the age of 150 in the legendary Battle of Bråvalla between Swedes and Danes in the 700s.
And was this a real battle?
No, it's legendary in the sense that it is stuff of legend.
Oh, it's not like, that was such a legendary battle, man.
No, it's literally a legend battle.
The way you stabbed him with that spear, legendary.
The way judging by his name, he probably bit his enemies to death with his war tooth. And then he went home to his lovely, lovely wife, Elsa.
Yeah.
throwing another dart at these list of kings.
I haven't heard any of these beforehand, and I'm just laughing because I can see this guy's name written down, and it's brilliant.
It's Erik Weatherhat, which means weather hat in English.
So he's got a weather hat. No, so it's like, you get those hats with little, not umbrellas, but the twirly things.
Like that measures the wind.
Yeah. So you've got one of those, and then you can have a sundial on there, and maybe like a little bowl to catch it if it rains. So he has a hat which can tell the weather.
Yeah, so he is mentioned by the Swedish priest and, in quotation mark, historian Olaus Magnus, who's writing in the 16th century, so quite a lot later. And he's also mentioned by the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus in the late 12th century.
Who himself sounds like some sort of time-traveling Roman.
Yeah, Saxo Grammaticus is the root cause of a lot of these fictional accounts of kings in Scandinavia. So Mr. Weatherhat is meant to have lived sometime in this gap between Iron, Viking Age, generally a mythical time in the past. Or actually, he's not Mr. Weatherhat, he's King Weatherhat.
Yeah.
His power...
He was presumably Mr. Weatherhat before he became King Weatherhat.
Yeah, true. Well, the root of his name apparently comes from that he was so powerful that, quote, wherever he turned his hat, the weather would turn in the same direction.
Oh, so it's not tell the weather, it's
No.
control the weather.
He controls the weather with his hat. He's also believed to be the same person, or maybe same character is a better phrase, as at least two other fairy tale kings. So, elusive character, to say the least. Elusive, but with a great name. Now, are you ready for a third and final dart thrown into the list of these fairy tale kings?
Yes, because these are brilliant.
Yeah, so Ottar Vendelkråka.
Okay.
Now, again, funny name. Kråka in Swedish is crow, so the bird. So he's Ottar Vendelkro.
Mm-hmm. And Vendels were a people.
Yeah, so is he a crow of the Vendels? What does that even mean?
I don't know.
No, this guy is thought to have reigned in the early 500s, and that he was the king of the Svea.
Who we mentioned.
Yeah, this people that we mentioned in the previous episode, and he had his seat in Uppsala
Just a seat.
for his crow.
Yeah. So he reigned in Uppsala.
Yeah, but the seat of his
Yeah,
power.
I know. I was joking.
There is an actual physical grave mound close to Uppsala.
More graves. We can't ever escape the graves.
No. And this grave was thought to be King Vendelkro's. Now, it can't be archaeologically proven that it is his grave, if he existed, but we know for sure that a Roman coin dated from before the year 477 was found there. So it's the grave of someone, probably in this period. Now, Vendelkro or no crow, there is a grave mound that has traditionally had his name. We also know of Ottar and his funny surname because he gets mentioned in both Beowulf.
Yeah, the English sort of saga.
Yeah, and in the previously mentioned Ynglinga saga, where King Ylfe, the other fictional guy or fairy tale guy, also got a mention.
Okay, well, those were very entertaining, definitely fake kings, but you've also done a lot of looking into the sort of real people that we might be talking about as we get into the Viking Age.
Yeah, should we get back to reality, leave the crows and the tooths and the hats behind us, and get back to reality and a man by the name Olof Skötkonung. Now, he's the one that at least I was taught in school was the first real king. He reigned from approximately 995 to 1022, and I would suspect he gets the title as first real king because we know he was a king because he makes a coin in his name, like how we now have the Queen on British pound coins, or the current king of Sweden, Carl Gustaf XVI, is on the Swedish coins. So, because Skötkonung brought English coin makers over to Sigtuna, a town just west of Stockholm, in the late 900s, and made a coin with his face on, we have something tangible to say that he was king.
That is very good. I do like coins, and I like the story of English coin makers going over to Sweden to make the coins for him. I wonder how he got those. We'll have to cover it when we get to that point.
Definitely. We'll definitely come back to Skötkonung, because not only is he the first king with a coin, he is also the first Swedish king, but the last Scandinavian king to convert to Christianity around this time, the turn of the millennia. So I was taught that Skötkonung was like the first proper king of Sweden. I looked at the official website of the Swedish royal family, and they actually start their sovereign list with one before Skötkonung, and there's quite a few accounts of Swedish royal history start one before. So we've moved on.
Who's his dad?
Yes.
And that's why they start with him, because if we know about him, then presumably he had a dad.
History has progressed since I was in school 20 odd years ago.
And his dad had one of those names that would really feel right in place in the sagas.
Yeah.
Eric the Victorious.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
So it's called Erik Segerhäll in Swedish, but it's translated as victorious in English. And he reigned from approximately 970 up until approximately when his son Skötkonung takes over 995.
And very briefly, as this is becoming a longer episode than we thought it would be, Skötkonung's mum was a woman known as Sigrid the Haughty, who was queen consort of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and England at various points in her life.
Very, very powerful woman.
But she's important because she's mentioned in a lot of the sagas.
Yeah.
So this is perfect example of how the sagas are mixing in with the coins and the hard, real history.
This is the gap.
Yeah.
We are right in the middle of the gap.
And we are minding it.
We are minding it. We're in the gap between fiction and fact, but we're also starting to get into the Viking Age by this time.
This sort of gap between history and myth doesn't just last for the Vikings. It goes on for quite a while, doesn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to note that the official list of sovereigns published by the Swedish royal family, they put the term approximately for the reigns of the first 22 kings. So it's not until the reign of Knut den Långe, or Knut the Tall, as it'd be in English, in 1229 that we start to get definite dates and years for their reigns.
Wow, that's a long time after in England
Yeah.
we have definite dates for kings.
So there are hundreds of years of Swedish royal history, 22 reigning monarchs in total, where we have to be a bit approximate in the account. We don't know exact date.
And that really tells us something about history then, and how difficult it is to be exact. When even as late as the 13th century, we're still saying, maybe at this time, not really sure.
Yeah. We've had some amazing kings, more or less real ones. But should we move on to peoples that weren't all kings?
Yeah, who they would actually be ruling over if they did exist.
Peoples or tribes that are believed to have inhabited the territory that is modern day Sweden. So we already talked about the Svear and the Götar in the last episode, and that was seen as real historical facts until relatively recently. It's relatively recently that they've started to question sort of whether Svear or Götar, were they actually defined groups? Would they have been aware and identified themselves as such? And I'd just like to build on what we talked about with the Svear and Götar with a few more peoples that get mentioned. usually mentioned along with Svear and Jötar from this period are a people called Gutar, or Guts in English. This is a people with a very clearly defined area of origin because it's an island, the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea off the east coast of modern-day Sweden.
That makes it a little easier.
Yeah, exactly. They're easier to pin down. The prime piece of text that talks about the Gutar is another saga called Guta Saga from the 13th century, and the actual physical copy of it is kept in the National Library in Stockholm.
That's nice. We'll
So
have to
you can
go visit.
Yeah, you can go and see it. They used to often be mentioned when talking about Gotland pre-Christianity and before Gotland became a part of an established Swedish nation state. In fact, some historians have even claimed that there's a link between Gutar and the famous Germanic tribes, Goths.
Interesting.
Yeah, but historians also claimed that there was a link between the Jötar and the Goths.
Because they have a similar name.
Yeah, so it's all a bit murky here. And the story of the Gutar definitely straddles the area between fact and myth. For example, they have their own creation myth around the Gutar, like an Adam and Eve type tale. And just to mention it briefly, it's about how a man called Kjellvar, who gets a mention in the Edda, another saga by the way, breaks the spell that kept Gotland underwater and thus brings the island to life. Regardless of the Gutar and who they were as a people and if they were a people and what have you, Gotland was historically an isolated region because it's an island and consequently had its own unique history and developed its own unique identity and concept of its own history.
Which they still have today in terms of identity.
Yeah. And so it's not strange that these ideas of the history of a people come about. And just to make things a whole lot more confusing, there's another people whose name also begins with G, the Geats.
You can play as them on Attila Total War, which
Really?
I've been doing recently.
I find it very confusing because now we have the Jötar, the Gutar, and the Geats.
Yeah.
And
they might be related to the Goths.
yeah, there's too much similar sounding words. Anyway, the reason we're even talking about the Geats is because they are mentioned in Beowulf and also in a poem called Widsith. From those sources, it's very unclear who these people are and where they'd be. Some have placed them on Gotland, so making them the same as the Gutar. Some have placed them more in sort of south-central Sweden, the area that's usually attributed to the Jötar. So maybe they're the same, maybe they're different people, who knows? It's not like Beowulf is famous for its many references and footnotes and historical accuracy necessarily.
Yeah, that is in the level of saga.
Yeah. We also get peoples who are referred to as Norse and Danes around these times. And these peoples are clearly more linked to modern day Norway and Denmark. Norse, Norway, Danes, Denmark. You can really still hear the connection there.
Yeah, and well, the Danes, they became much more established as the Danes a lot earlier before Sweden, and certainly Norway as well. So that makes sense.
Yeah, and
Sweden's last.
Yeah, we're the last to be defined as both a people and a territory in comparison to Norway and Denmark. Even though Norse and Danes, they're more related to Norwegian and Danish history, it's worth mentioning the Danes quickly because the area that's usually attributed to the Danes contains some of what is modern day Sweden.
Yeah, so that's why we said in the last episode, bye-bye to areas like Skåne, because that's really now at this point is Danish history.
Yeah.
And part of Denmark for 1,000 years or so.
Yeah, so Danes would have lived in what is today's eastern Denmark, but also in what is southern Sweden. Whereas the bit of Denmark that is the peninsula that sticks up from the European continent would be home to another people, the Jytar. In fact, that part of Denmark is still called Jutland. But we'll leave that to a History of Denmark podcast to look at. But just to mention that the Danes lived in what is modern-day Denmark, but also in what is modern-day Sweden.
Nice and simple.
Similarly, Norse or Norsemen gets mentioned a lot now we get into the talking about the Vikings. Now, rather than being a people, this is more likely to be a linguistic term referring to all Northern Germanic people who spoke Old Norse. So essentially, Norse or Norsemen, well, it's what today has become Scandinavians.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sometimes this term seems to have been used interchangeably with what we call Vikings when we talk about history today. For example, on the inscription on the monastery in Lindisfarne, which we'll talk about in our next episode, it says, "From the rage of the Northmen, please spare us, O God." But those Northmen we usually refer to as Vikings. Finally, we mentioned a guy called Jordanes last episode. Now, he was an Eastern Roman historian, and in the 6th century, he wrote Skansa, a book about the area that we today call Scandinavia. As I believe we touched upon last episode, Skansa mentions several people who he says live in this area. There is the Sviona, another name for Svear, the Adogit, which some believe to have been a misspelling of Hagoland in Norway.
Really, really misspelled. It's just got a G in it.
Well, maybe the A could be pronounced like a H, so it's Hadogit.
Maybe.
This is an example of how, like, you really want to find a source in history, so you're trying to find a grain of something in a book to then make and say, oh, maybe this was these people.
That's like saying, oh, Ireland, you must mean England.
He also mentions a people called Hallin. Some have believed that, oh, well, then that's from the modern-day southwestern Swedish county of Halland. Jordanes also mentions a people called Skrefinne, which has been translated to Swedish as skidfinnar, or skiing Finns. Some suggest that this refers to the indigenous Sami, who still live in Sweden today. So stick a pin on that when we come back to the history of the Sami people, that there is this mentioned in Jordanes' book. But in general, I really don't give much for this Jordanes guy and his book and the mentioning of peoples in what is modern day Sweden. There might be some truth to it. People have definitely tried to look to it for historical facts, but
I think all it probably proves is there were people in Scandinavia. And
Yeah.
that's it. Just forget it
And I
about
mean-
everything else.
Jordanes thought that the area was an island to start with, so he got that wrong. And he claimed that some of the people still lived in caves. So, that's fairly prejudice and just a bit all over the page. Maybe he was acting in good faith. Maybe he just didn't know more. But I suspect he's sprinkling a lot of myth over his story. And
He's writing a Eastern Roman saga in many ways.
true. And in general, when I did research for this episode, it felt a bit like reading history about history,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. And there seems to have been a time when, in the study of not just history, but also anthropology and other social sciences, there was a great fondness of talking about peoples or tribes and classifying people. And we see this with these peoples of ancient Scandinavia, ancient Sweden, their mythological kings. It says a lot about the people who wrote that history, of the history of the history. But perhaps now, in our modern times, this type of history is starting to be rejected. Perhaps we just can't classify people, especially not when our sources are half fiction, half fact.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me.
But that's not to say that these things, like the sagas or Beowulf or Eastern Roman historians writing about Scandinavia, what have you, that they've not got their place in history, but they should be read for what they are. Semi-fictional accounts, partly fictional accounts, and in some cases, as with the sagas, they're written a long time after the events would have happened.
Yeah, so all done, I think, then, I
Yeah.
guess, for the minding of the gap.
And I think the key really is to just mind the gap. We don't need to throw these sources out of the window, but we need to look at them for what they were.
Well, if you want particularly more detail on the sagas, do listen to Saga Thing. Even if it's just their introductory episode, which talks about what are sagas, they talk about this in a slightly more
Yep.
succinct way than we have.
Yeah, and if you're bored now, there's still lockdown and the COVID-19 outbreak. If you're bored, just Google the mythical kings, the Sagokungar, and you can read a lot more about people called Wartooth and Weatherhat, and in general, just have a bit of a laugh about these out of this world characters.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that bit, so I hope you did too. And if you enjoyed it, please leave us a review if you want to. And as always, let your friends and family and loved ones and work colleagues and
in fact, even let your enemies know.
Postmen.
Yeah.
Let everybody know that
Dogs,
we're available.
Canaries, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Next time, Vikings.
Yes, exciting.
We are coming.
We are coming in our longboats towards the Vikings. But until then, it's goodbye from us.
Bye-bye. Hey, doll.
Hey, doll.